Jed is obviously a fast writer at heart.
Yeah, I think that the fact that my writing is so unintentionally comical was part of the permissiveness of being able to bring humour into it.
So welcome to this evening's event at the Edinburgh Book Festival, and welcome to those of you at home who are watching at a distance. But you lucky guys are here in the room with me, isn't that smashing? I've really missed that, missed the excitement of a live audience this last year or so. So I'm going to ask you now to strap in and prepare for liftoff into a conversation that's out of this world. One thing audiences have become even more enamoured of in lockdown is convoluted and complex storytelling plots. We want to be entertained, but we also want to feel like our intelligence has been respected. And that's a large part of the reason why a record-breaking 12 million viewers turned into the final episode of Jed Mercurio's police corruption drama Line of Duty earlier this year. If you're feeling withdrawal symptoms, help is at hand. Here it is, Sleeper. The opening installment in the adventures of DS5, a bionic marshal of the Office of Off-World. It's set in the 24th century, where humans are emerging from a devastating carbon war thanks to a miraculous new clean energy source called Titan Green, mined on Saturn's moon by a rapacious corporation. The stakes could not be higher. And like Ted Hastings, DS5 is programmed to find the truth, whatever it costs. To tell this story, Jed has teamed up with actor, writer and director Prasanna Puwanarajah to create a science fiction graphic novel that narrates a space opera conspiracy thriller with a twist on the familiar tropes of the cowboy adventure and the private eye novel. They brought on board Valencian artist Coke Navarro to illustrate their tale, because why would you not want a die-hard fan of shadowy 1990s comics like Sin City and Hellboy to bring your words to life? When Prasanna was cast in Jed's 2018 medical TV series Critical, the two bonded over a shared past as medics. It wasn't long before they discovered they had something else in common, a love of science fiction. Jed, what were your entry points into the genre of science fiction?
Oh, I think I started by watching science fiction on TV. So it will have been Star Trek, the original series. That was such a powerful influence, by far my favourite programme until I kind of hit teenage. And then I started to read. So then it was science fiction novels, and mainly the kind of hard SF, the sort of Asimov, Clarke, Heinlein type. And then really from that point forward, I've watched science fiction mainly on the screen, so mainly movies since then.
And Prasanna, what about you? What was it that dragged you towards the genre?
It's a couple of things. Cartoons initially, sci-fi cartoons from the 80s, those things that were kind of designed to sell toys. I was watching things like Thundercats and Mask and Centurion and Starcom and all these sorts of things. And then when I got into my early teens, this probably dates me, but I was sort of young enough to find Star Trek: The Next Generation quite dazzling as a show. So I watched that religiously, really, through the 90s. And also in secret. It kind of wasn't cool to be into a show like that, but I found it was a way into stories about people who were just quite naive about human behavior and exploring it through a kind of, through travels through space. So, yeah.
I remember reading Asimov and the like in my own teens, and John Wyndham particularly, and I spent a lot of time thinking, God, wouldn't that be amazing? Did you both have that same sense of excitement and amazement about it?
I used to go to sleep and wish that I would wake up having been beamed aboard a starship. I was completely obsessed and enthralled by the possibilities of it. Yeah, and then latterly kind of, I guess the crossover into where science fiction hits the space that Jed and I and Coke were looking at with this book, was sort of starting to read more about the moon landings and Apollo and Gemini and how things ended up in a kind of rustier, more kind of tactile space. Yeah.
By the way, in case the audience think I'm being really rude and not looking at these guys behind me, I do actually have their faces on monitors in front of me as well. So I'm not just going like, whatever. Now, I've often discovered common ground with other writers, but it hasn't actually led to massive narrative collaborations. How did talking about Isaac Asimov and Thundercats bring the two of you to the conclusion that you'd be good together?
Well, I think it was because those conversations coincided with me wanting to make more projects. That I had come off the medical drama critical, and that was really when Line of Duty really started to take off. And then I went into doing Bodyguard, and so the other side of that was, there were lots of projects that I really wanted to do, but I just didn't have the time to develop them into my own TV series. So knowing a lot of writers socially, I'd always thought that there were opportunities for collaboration there if the right project came up. So those conversations between me and Prasanna ended up taking the form of a kind of what if? What if this was the precinct of a science fiction show? What if this was the type of protagonist? And those conversations eventually developed into the concept for the graphic novel.
And for you, Prasanna, were you thinking about working with somebody else? Was this something that had crossed your mind already? A project?
Yeah, I mean, I am, as well as an actor, I'm a filmmaker and theatre director, and so I come from a kind of space of collaborative storytelling, I suppose. So the notion of working with someone really closely from the genesis point is something that I've done before and found valuable. I think what's good about it, rather than arriving in a project later on, is you have the kind of spiritual and narrative and emotional investment in things from the top and between the two, and then later on the three of us, when Coke came on board, you can feed in a much more kind of personal, specific way. So yeah, I'm really into it. I think, and you know, like, good collaborators just make your stuff better, I think. I mean, maybe Jed wouldn't say the same thing, but but yeah, I mean, you know, if you trust the people that you work with, there's only going to be an enriching of things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's been very much the three-way collaboration since Coke Navarro came on board. I mean, he's a fantastic artist, but also he's really been brilliant in interrogating the material and asking us what we really meant, what we think something should look like, and he's a brilliant problem solver and a brilliant collaborator.
And you're right that it's trusting someone to be able to do that that's at the heart of any working collaboration. So did you get onto the same wavelength right away? Was it an easy start, or was it a bit more tentative, feeling your way with each other?
I think we pretty much just got to it. I think it's quite a practical approach at first. It's just hammering out events, really, things that happen as the first kind of tag into a character and who they are. And we just knock a document back and forward, really, and just be like, what about this and what about that? And then, you know, we kind of go, well, maybe this, maybe that, whatever. And eventually that document would be sort of, you know, 5,000 words long or something, or, you know, and it would contain the nut of what the story was going to be, and then we just sort of flesh it out. I mean, we would sit down from time to time together and talk through specifics, but then it would just be a kind of, I guess, writing by tennis, I guess, Jed, you know.
Can you remember how you first came up with those key elements of the story? You know, the bionic figure who doesn't really get the human stuff, the clean energy source, the choice of like hero and sidekick. Was that a lot of toing and froing, or were they ideas that came together?
I think that the conversation I remember most clearly was when we discussed what form the protagonist would take. Because for a while, at the very beginning of the conversation, we were talking in terms of a straightforward law enforcement character. And then what was introduced into that conversation was the idea that the character should be an iconic science fiction protagonist, someone who followed in the tradition of the Blade Runner or the Terminator. And that was the thing that led us into thinking about him being an enhanced human being, having not special powers really, but having biologically changed abilities and skills, which, as well as having a benefit, they also had disadvantages. And we talked about a kind of model for it in a very old science fiction short story, Scanners Live in Vain by Caldwainer Smith, which was something I'd read as a kid, and it had always stayed with me as a kind of model of retro sci-fi.
So the book starts with effectively mass murder and a potentially corrupt space mining corporation with a monopoly on clean energy. The protagonist, I think we'd have to call him DS5, starts as a machine, and by the end of this first installment, we have a sense of his underlying humanity and a feeling of pathos attached to that, which I think makes us connect much more deeply with him as a character as it progresses. How important was that to you, to build connection with us in that way? Was that something you considered right from the start, or was it something that grew?
I think that grew, actually. The notion that the character would undergo changes to their alterations as a result of interacting with the precinct was something that came about over the course of developing both the protagonist and the precinct, and how the effect of being in that specific space, which is, I guess, something that we always think about, like what the reason for the protagonist being in that space is narratively, and what the pressures are that are placed on them. And it just felt interesting to push the protagonist into a space of naive humanity, I suppose. I think there's something interesting about science fiction as a sort of circle in which to ask simple questions about, well, not simple, I mean, the most profound questions in some ways, but straightforward questions about how we myth make and how we tell stories and how we imagine and what we think of when we think of our futures and our pasts. And so we wanted there to be a sense of being able to explore those things while there was this kind of procedural engine happening alongside.
Yeah. So in the way that Heinlein does with Stranger in a Strange Land, that sense of naivety, and in a way you explain the world to us ourselves through their eyes. Kind of.
I mean, I guess there's also, I mean, just going back to The Next Generation, there's a character like Data who is in so many ways a superior version of a human, and in so many ways a kind of chasm away from understanding even the simplest nature of human interaction. So yeah, I think there's it's an interesting space to kind of to push a character into while they're exploring a thing procedurally that is also potentially taking them back into their own past as well. So we're trying to plait together a lot of different things.
Yeah, it's also very telling that Prasanna mentioned Data from Next Generation rather than Spock from the original series as being that quasi-human person that allows you to explore the human. Spock was a character in the original series, Prasanna. He was the Vulcan.
I've heard of him, yeah. I think my parents remember it from their childhood, Jed. So.
I wonder, because the pair of you have both got a background as medics, and that makes me kind of suspect that you feel most comfortable when you think you've got a firm scientific basis for what you're talking about. You like to have something firm to plant your feet on, as it were. At least give that impression that you've got something solid to plant your feet on. How did you manage to make the otherworld science of the Saturn moon and Titan, how did you manage to make that feel authentic, feel really grounded? Was that something you talked a lot about?
Yeah, we did. I mean, I think we felt that we had to take the same approach to all the science. We couldn't invest the medical side, the biological enhancement of the character with huge amounts of detail, and then just skirt over the astronomy. So again, that was something I was very interested in as a kid, and when I was doing A-levels, I honestly thought that I would probably do a degree that was either physics or astronomy or something like that. It was quite a late decision for me to do medicine. So I've always been interested in that aspect of science fiction, and so was Prasanna. And we're very fortunate to live in an age now where Titan isn't opaque to us. There's lots of information about Titan, and the problem we had to solve related to the temperature. That it just felt that it was going to be too cold for the story to work, which was where the idea came from to solar form Saturn and create something that worked in two ways. Firstly, it allowed the story to take place in that location, but it also allowed us to keep the setting within the solar system. We were kind of keen to have those recognizable touchstones rather than set it in another kind of solar system where you kind of have the idea of, as in Star Trek, where there's a limitlessness to travel, that faster than light travel is something that's done routinely, and I guess we kind of bump up against that.
Yeah, we were trying to work out things in the when we were breaking the story down, things like the communication time between Saturn and the Earth, as limited by the speed of radio waves, and we were kind of going like, what's the offer there narratively in that delay? The fact that there's a certain amount of stuff that can happen in that piece of time where information is traveling became a sort of useful thing. I mean, Jed would always say that what we should really do is invent as little as possible. And I think what we ended up doing is trying to come up with some sort of rationale, I guess, scientific rationale or philosophical rationale for something happening without necessarily getting, I wouldn't say bogged down, but kind of over-obsessed with, the physics of turning a gas giant into a star and so on. There's clearly a kind of, as you say, Val, a kind of a space opera element to those bits of the imaginative lead, which I think could push the book into an exciting place and not a too prosaic space. Sorry.
I think that's right. I think that we were looking at what gave us the best narrative solution that felt like it worked at least well enough for us to embrace it. And obviously, we completely disregarded the drastic gravitational consequences of solar forming a gas giant.
It's a bit like Jane Austen, isn't it, in the Jane Austen novels? Because a letter would take 2 weeks to arrive, say, it gave time for a key bit of the plot to work itself out. That's an amazing
reference. Not one, believe it or not, the Jed considered, but I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, more influenced by Steve Austin than Jane Austen.
I think as a writer of fiction myself, one of the things that I'm always thinking about when I'm constructing characters, when I'm imagining what kind of person would do the things I have them do in this book, one of the things that I always come back at is finding their hinterland, finding what it is in their history, what shaped them, what made them the person that thinks this is a reasonable way to behave. Was that something you spent a lot of time with on this?
Very much so, yeah. I think we're heading towards that place, I guess. I mean, as an actor, that's at the root of trying to work out who a character is. You know, like what's the kind of nut at the centre of them that drives everything. But yeah, I mean, I think as we kind of expand book by book, we want to try and get into that and explore that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely part of the thriller element to look at how that character made the choices he did in the past and what consequences those choices have in the present.
I think, to me, it seems you've come up with a language throughout the book that feels realistic, not just not just a language literally, but a language of the storytelling as well, that feels like it feels realistic, it feels like it could work. So having come up with this idea, how far into it were you before you brought Coke Navarro on board? And what made you realize that he was the right artist to realize the sort of visual equivalent of what you'd already imagined in your heads?
Well, Jed and I had worked quite extensively on the architecture of the broader story. We'd really shelled out what this first book would be in a very detailed way, and Jed. It was Jed's thought that this would be a really interesting thing to kind of push it into the graphic novel space. And so we were thinking about illustrators, and I'd worked with Coke at the Royal Shakespeare Company. He'd designed a poster for a play that I'd directed there. And we sent him some materials, some bits of the writing, some images that we put together as kind of moods, references and things. And he kind of immediately, he was immediately kind of riffing off it and putting together some concept bits and pieces. And I think it was an exciting time. I think we knew we'd found our guy pretty early. And he was really into it. I don't know whether we could maybe just show a couple of slides at this point, because it is quite fun, some of this stuff, for any of the nerds watching. Yeah, so this is Coke here. He did these brilliant little portraits of us for the book, and he's not here with us. He's in Valencia, but he might be watching. So hello, Coke. But he really is a genius. And he sort of started off doing these little kind of clay sculptures on the back of side plates, and he would do them just to explore anatomy and form and character. And he would sort of head them toward, and this was in advance actually of us starting work on the book. So this was a really kind of like a physical, a kind of a speculation space for us, and it would lead to these kind of concept images. So this is not a piece of artwork in the book. This was ways in which Coke would communicate his thoughts with us, and we would communicate back in terms of kind of exploring character through composition and light, and finding the kind of dynamic range of the character through sort of single images. And he would do this for a number of different characters. So we were looking at this sort of slightly mustachioed Josh Brolin, No Country for Old Men type flavour as well, when looking at these sorts of secondary characters in the Titans Sheriff Department, and we would get into the detailing of, you know, how these guys would wear suits that were taped up with gaffer tape because of the kind of relative age of what they were equipped with compared with DS5. So this was sort of really early on in the process of kind of working it out. And I think when you're working with a collaborator who's coming up with material like this, you know that you're onto the collaborator that you want to be working with.
Yeah, I mean, he just did a fantastic job. I mean, it was just such an obviously fertile collaboration straight away. And the other thing, I mean, there's one word we haven't really mentioned yet, which is Western. That one of the aesthetics that we wanted to introduce to the overall concept for the graphic novel was the idea of the Western. So that's why some of the imagery does actually relate to quite iconic images from High Noon and other classic westerns.
And I love the Sheriff's Star. I think that's a great little nod to the Western. And
it's also just a way of exploring things that probably won't change that much, I guess. It was one of the things that we were talking a lot about, which is you know, tables will probably still look like tables. And you know, in an environment that we envisage Titan to be, which is a kind of Alaska type place that's once again had has had a resurgence of interest. You can imagine those spaces being policed in a similar way to how they are now, and how they were, as Jed says, in times of, well, at any points where humans have lived along frontiers. So that was a kind of, I guess, a sort of social reality that we were trying to dip into, even when we were designing the physical detailing, and that sheriff's badge is sort of very much part of that.
Yeah, I think it's about sort of looking into history for models of institutions and hierarchies. So I know we keep going on about Star Trek, and I'm really sorry, but it was like one of the things that Star Trek did very well was that it took the idea of the Navy as the model institution and transplanted it into the science fiction setting there. It wasn't like some science fiction before that had been on screen, which took a completely invented approach. It would be a scientist and one of their mates. They would be the crew. It didn't have a hierarchy. And so it felt important to us that we looked at examples in the real world. And that took us back to the American frontier and the idea that you needed a specific kind of law enforcement to work on the outer reaches of a society.
Yeah. So now we're sucking Titan green. Yeah, I think when you started working with Coke, were you nervous about what the images were going to be? I did a graphic novel myself earlier this year, which was based on a series of radio plays that I'd done, and when we chose the artist, we looked at various samples from several artists, and we chose a particular artist, a young American artist called Catherine Briggs. And I remember feeling quite nervous when she went off with the script to do some sample pages for us. And I was thinking, what if we don't like it? What are we going to say to her? You know, but as it turned out, her drawings were absolutely terrific and so on the money.
But is this what you're talking about?
That's what I'm talking about.
It's excellent, and it's available from all good bookshops.
And some pretty rubbish ones as well.
Any bookshop will have it.
Yeah, thank you. But did you have that sort of moment where you were sitting thinking, what are we going to get back?
You know what? I think for me it was kind of like, because we knew what he was capable of, because you could see the references that we'd given him were exciting him in his initial sketches, and also the body of his of work that he'd done. It was clear that the kind of the tonal space of his work was a total fit. He was interested in the same questions, really, that we were interested in. And that's when you know, I think, that a collaboration is going to go well, because you're all interrogating the same space. And he was actually, like Jed said earlier on, he was kind of interrogating it at a level far more, at a higher resolution than us, because of course he's the person who has to sit and draw it. And if he goes, I don't know what's happening on this shoulder epaulette, I don't know why it would be like that, then the pen doesn't yield to him. So actually, in a way, what happened was the opposite thing, which was, I was just incredibly excited, and he kept on delivering these extraordinary images.
Yeah, it's also a relationship that's analogous to one you have with collaborators in film and TV. That if you generate the script, then it's all well and good writing a script that works on the page, but people have to perform it, and you have to be able to film it. And that's kind of the process that Coke took on, which is he had to realize the physical space, and it had to work. And that, once that had been addressed, it was a case of looking at things like the number of cells that you would devote to a particular story beat, the number of cells that you would combine for a particular page, and all those things that are kind of directorial.
And I think there's a really distinctive colour palette as well, the sort of sickly greens and blues that summon up another worldliness, but fit in, I think, completely with the story that you're telling, and it is very distinctive. It doesn't really look like anything else.
Well, we wanted to be starting from a kind of CRT space almost, you know, something that was, I mean, a lot of it, there are some quite chunky phones in this book. So we've dialed some of the tech backwards almost to a kind of robot. I mean, I remember like I did some research for a project, and I came across a really fascinating piece of information, which is that they still use those big square floppy disks on submarines. You know, the kind of ones the size of a child's pizza. and I found it fascinating that there's a level of robustness that can't be improved on, you know, or something. And, you know, red, green, and blue are just constituent elements of light in a way that won't change. And so we wanted to kind of not get too snazzy, you know. And then Coke did brilliant things about the unity of phrases within each chapter. So as you'd move to a new location, he would kind of just dink the color palette slightly. So we would kind of be, I mean, he very rarely uses more than 3 colors in a particular sort of section. So I wonder whether I can just bring up a little something here. So here's an image. I mean, this is right towards the end of the book, with a really particular kind of strange color palette. And it's an image at a reception, it's a presidential level reception. And it could so easily be a kind of mess of color, I think. And what Coke's been able to do is to really spin down, without losing the detail, a complex series of images into basically 3 colors, and black and white. And that would start, I mean, before we get into color, we'd be talking about composition at this sort of level. So it really is, you know, where's the camera, as Jed says? What kind of lens is it? What's the editorial decision from the image at the top, which is kind of a mid shot, I guess, to just moving down that line and bringing in some other characters, inviting the reader to sort of go, well, who are they in the foreground? So yeah, it's trying to keep things simple without losing complexity, and the color palette was a key part of that. And I think that's something that Coke was just expert at marshalling.
It also carries elements of the story through. I mean, that blue reflects another set of scenes in a location that's absolutely key to the development of the story and towards the end of the story. So you get those, in various points I noticed, you get those echoes of the colour palette from one.
And there's a kind of,
I
mean, just looking at our zooms here, the little green box around our, you know, it's a very, very pingy BBC Master 80s era green. So we wanted to use those greens in some of the depictions of DS5's point of view that he would see. You know, we wanted things to feel robust, and as I say, kind of unfanciful. So yeah, it's. I'm glad you've seen all those things. It's that we worked hard on weaving them all together. Coke did a brilliant job.
You see, you talk about this in a very relaxed and convivial sort of way. Was it really like that all the way through? Were there no moments of tension? Were there no moments where you went, no, you're just wrong?
Well, luckily we were very rarely, if ever, actually in the same room as each other, the 3 of us. We pretty much wrote the whole book on WhatsApp. we'd put together the cell list that Jed would describe, which is the kind of, this is what happens in each page, in each image. And then it's just thousands of WhatsApp messages. And it would be, some of them would be, not ungrumpy. when you've asked Coke to go back and address an image that he's, really not sure needs addressing, but it's, that sometimes it is just the thing that needs to be done, and so we would just, I think that it required a specificity of communication. I don't know whether you felt that, Jed. There was no real arm waving that you can do on WhatsApp. You just have to describe.
It's also the fact that if you've got 3 collaborators, it's always very easy for someone strategically to sit in the middle. So I could let the other 2 slug it out, and then if I came up with a compromise, I'd sound like the most reasonable guy in the world. And then I think that trick was something that people began to see through. And but it's, it's you kind of know when you're dealing with people that you can have reasonable conversations with, and that's why you choose the collaborators. We're both really experienced in working in collaborative environments, and we're used to those feelings of unease when you realize you're dealing with someone whose emotional or psychological overlay is going to make collaboration difficult. So we kind of never really had that. It was always about what is the idea here? What is the way of solving the problem constructively and artistically? It didn't mean we always agreed on what the artistic solution was, but we would talk it through, and eventually we would arrive at a solution that we agreed on. And I think that going back to something that Prasanna said very near the beginning, it's about collaboration improving the work.
And it's about that trust. It's absolutely essential for a collaboration to work well. There is one point, in fact 2 points in the book, where there are some quite intense wadges of text. There's a whole page of text. Out of nowhere, you turn the page and here's text, solid text. And that really came as a surprise to me. One of them, the first one, is a sort of spoof travelogue on guys on their gap year going to Titan before the mining started, when it was like, the absolute end of the empire that nobody would want to go to, that the tourist information office, only information they would give you was how to get off and go away. But then that also contains a surprisingly moving aside about the loss of Saturn's rings as a result of the mining. And then the other piece is a sort of very dense explanation of the genesis of sleepers like DS5, purportedly from the 24th century edition of the Lancet, which I thought was a nice little touch. What lay behind this departure, this radical departure from the graphic cells?
I think that graphic novels are such an interesting form, because essentially you can storytell in any way that you like. But what you do need, I think, when you're skidding along the top of a procedural landscape, is you do need to kind of drop some big bolts down into what the world is that's underpinning it, or if you're in a sort of sci-fi space, like, I guess. So it was, I think we just thought there was absolutely no reason why we shouldn't stick in a bunch of text, but not in a way that we felt the world needed exposition or anything like that. We just thought it was kind of world building and valuable to kind of get a sense of, in the first bit that you talk about, what the kind of history of the precinct was, and tell as much of that story as we could, sort of sideways, as you say, through this thing. And that bit that you talk about the travel agency comes from a travel agents that I went into in a small town in southern Romania, and they just had no leaflets about that town. just bus timetables. And the second piece was really a way of getting into and trying to hold the sort of the scientific space around DS5, and to generate, I hope, in the reader's mind, a kind of big question about his provenance, and another thing which we talked about a lot, and when we were putting together the story in its conception, I think Jed was very keen on there being a sense of mythology around sleepers in the world that we find him in, and in the time that we find him in, that sleepers haven't been encountered, that they are this kind of mysterious, almost mythological human variant that have developed their own kind of language of mystery around them.
Yeah, it was absolutely about mythologizing, definitely.
Yeah, and so we wanted to kind of do something that started in the realm of raw science and then ended up in the realm of like trying to articulate that science with a pre-existing myth, which I think is exactly where we are with science as it relates to the pandemic, for example.
Yeah, it was also a way of like doing something that was a little denser and in terms of conveying information. Like I always like that scene in Terminator 2 where young John Connor is asking the original Terminator about the technology behind the new Terminator who's chasing him down, and he asks a series of very obvious questions that obviously need to be addressed for the narrative, like why can't he turn himself into a bomb and blow me up, and things like that. And there are just certain things with the sleeper mythology that wouldn't come out naturally within the book, and it felt like an interesting way to create a history.
Yeah. Before I ask the last couple of questions, just say there will be a chance for you in the audience to ask your questions. And for you, if you who are watching online, if you go to the chat box, you can ask your questions there, and they'll come up on, as if by magic, on this wee tablet that I've got here. The one thing I wanted to ask you, as we're coming towards the end of this, two things really. What did you learn from this process? What has it changed in you as writers?
After you, Jed.
No, you. Never answer a question like that first.
I think it's this project has been about I think for me simplicity. Probably a surprising thing to hear because I do talk quite a lot. But I think when we were writing the original story, it was a kind of, the aim was to do it in the minimum number of words possible, I guess, so that the imagination of the reader could take the reins, I suppose. And we kept that going as we described the images on paper. So I think what the big lesson is that you know, descriptions are the starting point for an imaginative process, and the images that Coke generated and that we all kind of built together, coming out of that was a really good kind of demonstration of how that can work. So
yeah, and for me it was probably about character design. That I've never really done characters like this particular one, DS5, who I should say DS5 isn't Detective Sergeant 5. It's actually Deep Space Crime Human. But the characters I've tended to do in my other work have been kind of living in a grey area between right and wrong and good and evil. And to do a character like this who had very specific elements inputted into the design that related to his kind of sort of neuroatypical enhancements were kind of really interesting, and I really enjoyed that process.
One of the people who's from on the outside of this has sent a little question that was just about kind of what I was about to ask. Addy O has said, "Is this just the beginning? Will there be a sequel?" Now, I understand this is the start of a series, and in relation to that, I wanted to ask, how much of the planting of foreshadowing is in this book? How many things here will we look back at from later installments and go, aha, we should have noticed that?
Lots.
Good.
And I think what's fun about it is you can go back through. I don't know whether anyone listening to this remembers those choose your own adventure books, which were kind of faddish in the 80s, but they were quite fun kind of adventure game books where you'd get to the end of the page and it would say, if you want to take the left fork, turn to this page. If you want to take the right fork, turn to the... So there was always a kind of, there were so many different ways of experiencing the book. And I feel like, Jed was talking about this the other day at another event, where each sequential read of a book that has images, I guess, can draw up another level of understanding and richness. So the hope would be that people would be able to come back and kind of go, yeah, there's that.
Yeah. Well, I'll look forward to that. When can we expect the next one?
No, Monday, I think, was the...
Okay.
No, but...
That long?
No, we've got a little way to go.
So we've got time now for a few questions. So if we can have the lights up. Is there anybody in the room who's got a question ready to be asked? We have a roving mic, so if you could just keep your hand up while they get to you, that would be helpful. Here we go. Thank you.
Fascinating insights into the Sleeper book. Thank you very much. I think lots of us are looking forward to seeing HMS Vigil, which is about to set sail on our screens very soon. Are there any ingredients that we've seen in Line of Duty, or indeed in Sleeper, that might be appearing in that new production? For example, is there a figure like H?
Sorry, are you talking about Vigil?
Yes.
I've got nothing to do with Vigil.
Yeah, we can't claim any connection with that show, I'm afraid.
Okay, so fine. I'll just take a question now from internet viewers. And Fiona S. has asked, would you see this novel perhaps becoming a screen treatment in the future for the TV or for theatre or film?
I think we can write off theatre straight away. I think
it'd be an amazing durational monologue,
Yeah, that's sort of where we got the title from, was from the audience of one of Prasanna's plays. But I think it'd be great to see it on TV or on the big screen, but that's way off. We'd obviously be very excited about that prospect.
I'm not even going to ask you who would play DS5. Tom Cruise, probably. Anybody else in the room who'd like to ask a question? Don't be shy. I may have to start picking on you at random. Okay, so another one from remotely. Catherine O says, finding an illustrator, did you already have images in your mind and style, etc.?
Yeah, very much so. I think we talked a lot about image tone and texture and era, I suppose, and about kind of I guess sort of rhythms like kind of sci-fi versus noir, and we put together a bunch of images into a kind of mood document, and Coke's work was just, it just sort of seemed to sit across everything. I mean, we did speak to one or two other artists, and I think it's just a very different energy with each illustrator. So it was a real bullseye for us, luckily.
Yeah, I think you just know, don't you? I mean, because we looked at several artists with Resistance, and although they were all very talented and all had an interesting approach, we ended up, I think, going with someone who exhibited a range of images and styles that certainly spoke to me about what we needed for the finished book. Sometimes
I think those sorts of creative hires, or those collaborative starting points, it's the right one when you're immediately sensing that they're making your stuff more interesting, or they're opening it up already. It happens a lot in auditions. In the best auditions, you kind of go, oh God, this person is showing me something about this script that I didn't know was there, or something, you know. So yeah, it was in that kind of space, definitely. Yeah,
I think one of the things I learned from that process was what the artist can do in terms of expanding your story, expanding your vision. Because this for me started as a radio play, I had a narrator who carried a lot of the background, if you like, of the story. And I suddenly realized after Catherine sent me a few pages that the artist was doing the job of the narrator. They were filling in the background, they were coloring in all the stuff that the narrator said, but giving it so much more. And for me, that was a very exciting moment, because this is what I understood. The extra dimension that was being brought to the work, it wasn't just somebody drawing some pictures to illustrate what I'd written. It was actually someone creating a whole set of images that gave a completely extra dimension to my own work.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's what we got.
It's someone expressing and understanding. Oh, sorry, Jed.
I was just praising Coke and just saying that's exactly right. That what he did do was bring. You know, it sounds like a cliche, but he brought it to life. You know, that when we started getting very specific about, we think this is a mid shot and this is a close up, but it's not down the line, it's at an angle and maybe semi-profile or whatever. And he would kind of take those things slightly with a pinch of salt and give things what he thought was the strongest artistic look. And that's really the power of the imagery. And you're absolutely right, Val. You don't necessarily then need to have the step-by-step storytelling in prose.
Another thing that, we've got a question here. Yes, down the front.
I wondered, as a kind of follow on from that, normally I think I listen to a lot of writers who say they found it difficult to move their book, their work into some other medium because of holding on and letting go, you know, if you like, you know, like sort of, so they had a very distinct vision of how it would be. Did you find it easier because you collaborated right from the get-go, you know, like sort of, and with Coke as well? You know, like sort of that process of ownership, you know, almost mutated of itself and became different.
Yeah, you've always got to hand it over as a filmmaker, you know, to other people. You've always got to kind of open it up to others coming in going, I think it should be this, or people going, I don't think that really works, you know. And so, yeah, it was always a good sort of stage, I think. It can be, I think the bit of writing that can be really hard is when you're doing it on your own and you're doing it on your own for months or even years, and then people come in and you really have kind of, not only is it welded to you, but it's kind of like a series of diary entries of your soul or something, you know, and people coming in going, wow, I don't think you should be that, or something, you know. It's like, it feels like a very personal attack. So I think, yeah, it was there was a good kind of healthy distance keeping throughout.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because it's about the nature of authorship, and that is something that can be shared. And the advantage we had was that we went into the process on that basis, and when 2 became 3 with Coke joining, the space was created for him. There was absolutely made clear to him that it's not like, this is what we've written and you draw the pictures. It was, now we are 3 collaborators and we discuss everything, and everybody's view is as important as anybody else's.
Yeah. And there's just one last thing I'd like to say that struck me very forcibly as I was reading this. There are some lovely little touches of humour, which is not necessarily what you expect in this kind of dramatic storytelling. I'm thinking particularly of, there's a moment when DS5 is in his planetary vehicle, and he's going off to a remote site that he's never been to before, and he asks the navigation system for directions, and the navigation system says, would you like to avoid tolls? And I thought that first cracked me up because it was just so.
And he says yes.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Was the sense of humour between you something that was an important aspect of the collaboration? Was it something that got you over some of the bumps in the road?
Well, Jed is obviously a fast writer at heart, he's
yeah, I think the fact that my writing is so unintentionally comical was part of the permissiveness of being able to bring humour into it.
It's always good, though, isn't it? It's always good. You know, I think it's like when you know that you're having fun writing or doing something, it can be a bit of a red flag sometimes because it's like maybe no one else is. There's you need a bit of it, otherwise it all ends up kind of just being a bit navel gazing.
That's why there's so much black humour in Scottish crime fiction. We murder people with a smile on our face. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this evening. And I want to thank Jed and Prasanna so much for being with us. But more than that, I want to thank them for this excellent graphic novel. I recommend it to all of you. It's available in the bookshop here at the Book Festival. It's a fantastic bookshop. It's the old fire station, and it's open right through the Book Festival and hopefully even beyond, fingers crossed. So thank you very much for being with us this evening. And can we have a big round of applause here in the live? Thank you, guys.
Thank you.